brought to you by Accenture Extended Reality. This is Field of View.
Hello and welcome to Field of View. My name is Nick Rosa from Accenture.
And my name is Daniel Kolayani from the Academy of International Extended Reality.
And on this episode of Field of View, we're gonna go and navigate through all the fantastic world of data analysis, of behavioral analytics that are coming from deep research that is being conducted right now in laboratories around the world about extended reality and the way that users are behaving and interacting in those synthetic environments.
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in anything, I think the keyword today is going to be signal processing. But if you're interested in anything machine learning or based on how we can identify the signals from the brain and how that affects our experience when we are in extended reality, then this is the episode for you. Because Field of View is all about taking the origin story of individuals that are working within this field, working within this sector, and explaining how they got there, but also some of the really exciting things that they're working on at the moment.
That's right, Daniel. And you can find a new episode of Field of View every month on all the major platforms, Spotify, YouTube, Apple, and Google. And today with us, we have the pleasure and the honor of having Tiago Falk with us. Hi, Tiago. Tiago is the scientific head of the Multisensory Multimodal Signal Analysis and Enhancement Lab and professor at the University of Quebec, National Institute of Scientific Research in Montreal, Canada.
I definitely have a question for Tiago, which is my first one, which is going to be around how do you end up saying your full department's name? But as we already mentioned, we're going to talk about the real human kind of factors and measurements when it comes to kind of XR and biotech. But yeah, I mean, take it away, Tiago. Tell us about yourself. Who are you?
Yeah, well, thank you. So I'm a professor here at the Institut National de la Recherche Scientifique.
Your French is definitely better than mine.
The National Institute of Scientific Research. We're the research arm of the University of Quebec here in Montreal, Canada. And as Nick mentioned, I lead the Multisensory Signal Analysis and Enhancement Lab. And we've recently, over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, ventured into XR. My background has been more in human factors and human-machine interaction and using signal processing, combining that with machine learning, so that we can infer different human states. Especially our interest is in doing this with low-cost wearables so that we can have applications that could be used in real settings without very costly and research-grade equipment. Typically, these devices are very noisy, no context. So this is where a lot of the signal processing that Dan was mentioning has to come in. And a lot of data cleaning, data analysis, a lot of the contextual information has to be gathered from these signals. And over the years, we've done projects with first responders, for example, measuring mental workload of first responders, firefighters, police officers. We've looked at anxiety and stress states and burnout in nurses. So we've instrumented hospitals and nurses with wearables and building models of anxiety and stress. We've looked at drivers, looking at mental state of drivers and so on. So there's a lot of head movements when they're looking at their blind spots and so on. So these are all tools that, or these are all settings in real world applications where these tools weren't really built for. So you look at, for example, electroencephalography, where you're measuring brain waves. These were built for more clinical and neuroscience studies. And the basic assumption is the person is sitting still, try not to blink, and focusing on specific aspects, where now you're in a car is bumping around, you're moving your head around. So all of these artifacts that need to be accounted for. So this is where a lot of our research has taken place over the last decade or so. And as I mentioned, over the last few years, we've seen the growing interest in virtual reality. And when you talk about human factors and even our experience with different tools and technologies, the human state in which we're in is a big driving factor on our perception of experience. So usually in my class, I have a demo that I show where it's the final in the 2014 World Cup between Portugal and the US. And one team is down by 1, and there's like 30 seconds left in the game, and it's a decisive game. And then I give the example of, suppose you're watching this on your smartphone, and all of a sudden you have the wheel of death, and the game is paused because it's loading. And then when the game comes back on, the score has changed. Everybody's celebrating. You have no idea what happened. If you're a fanatic and you're really into the game, that has completely ruined your experience. That little wheel of death loading has completely ruined your experience. Suppose you're in the same device, same location, watching the news, and that happens, your experience might not be as ruined. So your connection to what it is that you're experiencing, how connected you are, how engaged you are, how much attention you're paying to, that really drives your experience. So human factors and virtual reality, back 5 years when we entered, we envisioned being an area that could really benefit from this expertise, because you could have two individuals side by side, same game. One is having the experience of their life. The other one is off in the corner throwing up, never wanting to put on a headset ever again. So the only thing that has changed between those two individuals is their human factors. It's their cognitive states. It's their states in which they were in. So we envisioned bringing in this human factors monitoring and wearables monitoring into XR as a tool to potentially help advance the field. And that's how I got into virtual reality. And then over the last few years, as you can see this booth behind me, we've looked into multisensory VR experiences, where that's now a completely new research field where there's very little research on. So now if you start throwing in smells and touch and haptics and wind and heat, how does that affect your experience? Can we track this information from these human factor measurements? And if we go into clinical, that's another podcast. If we start talking about using these tools for clinical applications, where right now all you can do is observe behavioral outcomes. So there's a lot of XR applications in the clinical world, and typically you require an expert to be evaluating the outcomes of the intervention, and these are very subjective. If the doctor leaves and somebody else replaces him or her, then you might have issues with measuring these outcomes and so on. So having these tools that can build quantitative, repeatable, long-term metrics could potentially have also groundbreaking applications in the clinical space.
The real question, so this sounds incredibly interesting, and it sounds like you have to have a lot of experience, especially academically, to be able to push into some of these areas. How does someone get started like this? I mean, what actually piques your interest from an early age, I guess, to look at this kind of stuff and to get stuck into this world?
I, as an early age, did not envision doing any of this. I've always wanted to be an engineer, an electrical engineer. I've always tinkered with computers and things like that. In university, I started research. I did my undergraduate in Brazil, and they have a summer internship programs that you can be part of. And in my second year university, I started with that. And every year since, I've been doing research, going to conferences, presenting my work. So right halfway through university, I knew that I wanted to be an academic and do research, and moved to Canada, started looking at building models of our perception of quality. So at the time, we were funded by a telecommunications service provider, and there was a lot of competitions with these telecom providers back then. And the only thing that made a customer stay with them and not go to somebody else is the quality that they provided. So for service providers, they needed to measure in real time the quality of the service that they were providing to the individuals. And you can measure quality of service just by measuring, for example, how many packets were lost or what is the noise of your channel. But ultimately, it's the user that's going to experience that quality. So you really need to bring in the user aspect into the equation. So that was my first venture into human perception modeling and auditory modeling, and trying to understand how we perceive audio and speech quality, and try to build models that could be used by the service providers to automatically measure what is the quality I'm giving this user right now, what is the quality I'm giving that other user. And if it goes below a certain threshold, then I can change things up. I can put them on a separate channel. I can put her in a different configuration. And ultimately, you're maximizing their experience. And this is what they envision being the best way to keep customers with them. And it wasn't until I finished my PhD and I started into my postdoc where I ventured into building assistive technologies for children with very severe and multiple disabilities. So this was at a children's hospital in Toronto. And this is when I got introduced to brain-computer interfaces, and measuring brain states. Up until then, it was completely driven from speech processing, speech signal processing, and machine learning. So that was my first venture into brain signals and trying to model cognitive states and trying to give a voice to these kids that could never, throughout their entire life, couldn't have communicated. So many of these kids through these devices were able to, for example, with a virtual keyboard on the screen, type for the first time, "Mom, I love you." And you were in rooms seeing kids and moms and parents and researchers, everybody crying because you're able to give this voice to this child, and then measure anxiety states. For example, we had researchers there that were looking at autistic kids who couldn't express their emotions, so looking at wearables to kind of give that cue to parents and individuals and teachers, for example, that don't have that experience with reading emotions from these individuals. So it provides this tool to give more intelligence to the world around them so that people can interact with them in a more appropriate way. So that was my venture into bringing into the body signals and brain signals into my research. And when I joined INRS, as an academic, you have to, when you pitch you're at your interview, you have to pitch that you're going to be doing something that none of your previous supervisors have done. It's something that you can set up a research program that's going to be unique. And that's when I started thinking about PhD in speech, postdoc in brain monitoring. Why don't I bring the two together? Why don't we try to use the brain to understand how we process speech? In the past, we modeled our perception or how we perceived quality without any information about the brain. Well, what if we started poking into the brain and measuring what the brain is doing? And what if we manipulated the audio quality and looked at the brain responses? What could we do? Could we build better models? Could we build models of experience? And that's how I started 12 years ago in my academic post, was proposing the use of brain-computer interfaces to better understand how humans, we do this processing very well. We can have conversations in noisy environments. We can filter all the noise out. We can focus on the person that's talking to us. Machines are not able to do that. So my goal at the time was to try to understand how the brain does it so that we could potentially help advance these human-computer interactions and interfaces.
This is so relevant for all the things that are happening right now. Everybody's talking about the metaverse, and the metaverse at the core is basically experience of the human, and being able to track the emotional state of people that are experiencing something is really substantial for the success of any of those worlds and branded experiences. I have a question for you, Tiago. Of everything that you're doing at your laboratory is done in the name of research and advancing our knowledge on how to process those data that you're gathering with all your experiments with virtual reality headsets. Can you give us an overview of the kind of data that you can collect, and an idea of how those data could potentially be processed by companies or brands, that be usable in a metaverse context, like, I don't know, profiling the user, understand the state of the user, and so on. Which kind of data you're tracking? Is it like eye tracking, body posture? What kind of data you're tracking in this kind of experiences, and how can you use them?
Yeah. So for us, we're interested in full body view. It's really, we're having a conversation. If we were doing this live to live, I could see based on your posture, based on your head sways, your head movements, your face, your yawns, I could get a very good sense as to how well I was doing in the conversation, how interested you were, how engaged you were, and so on. So it's a full body kind of interaction. And that's the mentality that we go in with our research, is to collect as much data as we can. And afterwards, in post-processing, we figure out what was useful, what was not useful. But we try to start with the most amount of signals possible. And of course, in a research setting, you can instrument people with EEG headsets, so electroencephalogram headsets, so you can measure certain brain signals. There are portable devices right now that measure blood flow as well, so-called functional near-infrared spectroscopy. So we can have headsets that also measure blood flow in different parts of the brain, and it gives you an indication of which cortices are active at certain points in time, and that gives an indication of what's happening in the brain.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
about the blood flow. Sorry to interrupt you. I know that it's possible to do an analysis of the blood flow using just a normal camera that is checking the variation of redness on your face, because basically the more blood you have under your skin, the redder it gets. So you can
Yeah.
check the variation frequency, and so you can check the pulse of a user.
Yeah.
Do you see this as an evolution of the kind of analytics that you can get? For example, I don't know, from eye tracking, the same camera can check also the color of your pupils in order to track your heartbeat and stuff like that.
Yeah, most definitely. That specific technology you're mentioning is a little different from the one that measures blood flow in the brain, because what you're mentioning is really looking at superficial, like skin type flow, whereas we want cortical flow. So it's a bit deeper. It's about 1.5 centimeters through the scalp, through the skull, into the brain. So it's a different technology, but that is ultimately what we try to do. So in a research setting, we can have as many devices as we want. We've built the tools to synchronize everything. But ultimately, what we want is devices that are standalone, that if you want this to be used at home, individuals are not going to put on a chest strap and a headband and a watch and all these other tools just before they start the game. That's not going to work. So that has been our principle all along, is to try to make something that can be usable. To us, there's no point in building something that's going to require 25 different devices. It's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars if nobody's going to use it. So we really want things that are off the shelf, things that consumers can go and buy. And we're focused on the signal processing and the machine learning pipeline that comes afterwards. So things that are agnostic to the user, they put the device on, everything else that we built goes in the background to make it usable. So of course, in that aspect, we want to be able to have tools that can measure as many modalities as possible with the minimum amount of sensors as possible. So a camera that would track eyes and, for example, the heart rate would be an ideal setting. And one of the lucky aspects for us is that when we measure these signals, they're mostly electrical potential. And when we talk about electrical potentials, there's a lot of signals that talk to each other and they overlap each other. So if you look at information on the face, for example, if you have sensors around the faceplate of the virtual reality headset, same sensors that are measuring EEG on the forehead could be capturing blinks and could be capturing horizontal eye movements, for example.
And the galvanic response eventually.
That would be a different sensor, but it could potentially be something that could be measured as well. But with the same sensor measuring just the electrical potentials around the face, those around the eyes could be, depending on how you analyze them, could be measuring eye movements. But at the same time, if you're moving your cheek because you're smiling or you're frowning or because you're excited, that also gets captured. So that same signal is carrying three different types of information. It could potentially be carrying face gesture information. It could potentially be carrying eye movement information, and it could potentially be carrying frontal asymmetry or frontal information about the brain. So it's all in that signal processing and separating these contributions of all of these signals. Depends on how you set your references. Your EEG signals could also be capturing heartbeats. We know that your heart rate is modulated by breathing. So if you hold your breath, or as you breathe and you take continuous breaths, your ECG becomes modulated by your breathing curve. So now it's all in the signal processing. Is you can take an EEG. From that EEG, you can take an ECG. From that ECG, you can calculate breathing. So now from one signal, you've been able to infer three different modalities. So that's we call that data imputation, where you're trying to imputate data from other data where all that information is buried or overlapping. We build the tools to separate them in a clever way.
And I suppose that you can build machine learning algorithms and models that can extrapolate the missing information from all the other sources in order to create the output that you desire.
Because Tiago, this is where you mentioned this thing about noise, right? Like, because and would you be able to, I guess, in addition to Nick's question, I guess, identify or explain actually what noise is when it comes to this data as well?
Yeah, well, noise can be anything. If you're looking at EEG, we're looking at the very tiny electrical potentials that, for example, the brain is generating when the neurons are firing. So now you have these electrodes that are measuring these microvolts of electricity. that are going to be buried in, if you just clench your jaw, or if you move your eyelids or your eyebrows up and down, that's going to generate artifacts, movement artifacts, because these are now muscle contractions that are generating electrical potentials that are orders of magnitude higher than the brain responses. So when we're talking about EEG, noise sources are any type of muscle movement, head movements, every time you move your head. In our case, we've been doing experiments with, for example, police officers running. So we want to measure, for example, the workload and stress while they're running. So we've had individuals in treadmills, we've had individuals riding bikes, and we've been trying to look at what type of artifacts are generated. And when the person is walking, for example, one thing that we weren't expecting was gait artifacts. So just the normal sway of the person as they're walking, it generated this very continuous sway artifact in the signal that none of the algorithms to date have been built for that, because nobody's assuming you're going to be walking around with an EEG headset on. So they always are looking for eye blinks, they're looking for muscle movements. So those are the type of artifacts that are typically removed from EEG signals. But once you throw this now into individuals that are boxing in virtual reality or running around and doing other things, new tools have to be developed. So noise sources might end up being things we hadn't even imagined when we talk about in the future. Astronauts may be using these types of things. I have no idea what to expect in terms of noise sources when you're in outer space with no gravity. There might be some other interesting things that will arise.
And then that goes back to Nick's question, right, around using machine learning and AI to process and sort through this noise, or I guess you also call it signal processing. So I guess there's a difference between that, or?
There is a difference, and I try to. I'm a signal processing guy, so I have to upplay the usage of signal processing. But machine learning is great in the sense that if you can provide it with data that is representative of the environment you're going to be in. If you just provide raw data to a machine learning algorithm, and that person was sitting down, for example, doing certain experiments sitting down, the machine learning algorithm is going to learn what it has to learn in that particular condition. If you then apply it to somebody else standing up or running or walking, that model will not work, guaranteed, because it has not learned, it does not know what patterns to look for, because it was not provided with those patterns. So signal processing, what it does is it tries to, before you apply this data to a machine learning algorithm, you try to potentially remove discriminative information. So if the data, for example, if you're moving around and these artifacts are going to contaminate your signal, you need to somehow remove these artifacts beforehand, because now if the person is walking, your signal is going to be contaminated, your model will no longer be valid. But if you remove those artifacts, then those same signals that were there when the person was sitting, they will end up showing up when the person is standing. So now by combining signal processing with machine learning, you could have models that apply across different conditions. So in a sense, you're trying to normalize the data, or you're trying to massage the data in a way that it becomes more representative of different conditions, as opposed to being very specific to a certain condition. Another thing that's very important for signal processing is context. So if you have a machine learning algorithm that's just tracking, for example, heart rate, and it detects that the heart rate went up, it might trigger some sort of alarm saying you're having a heart attack. Whereas in practice, it could just be the person is walking upstairs and all of a sudden the heart rate went up. Or the person ran to catch the bus, heart rate went up. So you really need to have context. So this is where signal processing can come in, and it can infer to the machine learning algorithm and saying, hey, this person is now running. This is the change in heart rate. This person is sitting. Here's another type of change in heart rate. So these changes in heart rate now will have different meanings based on context. And the machine learning algorithm alone does not have access to this context. It has to come through some other type of intelligence. So the way I usually say is that signal processing is there to provide additional intelligence to the machine learning algorithm to make the AI, more intelligent.
I have a question about the data lake that you use to train the algorithms. One of the big problem in obviously AI and machine learning is to find the right amount of data in order to train the models. How do you manage to collect all those data And also, are you using any sort of synthetic data to train your models?
It depends on what the application is. So when we're talking, one other area of our research is on, as I mentioned, we try to make things standalone. So an individual at home puts something on. Before your models kick in, there needs to be a lot of quality checks. So it needs to check,
Yep.
are the sensors placed on right? Is the quality of the data coming in well? Is the quality high enough for the models to operate in? So a lot of the work we've done over the years is to build these tools and measures of quality for various different sensors. So measuring
Scientific
quality
method, basically creating like a baseline in order to do the measurements and the capture of data all at the same baseline.
at the baseline, but also if a new data comes in, is this going to be a good quality data or is this a bad quality data? So we need to have measures of how good the
Okay.
quality of the ECG coming in is. So you can provide your machine learning algorithm with information about the quality of the signal. And if the person put the headset on wrong and now all of garbage is going to be coming in, there's an old saying in machine learning that if garbage is coming in, garbage will come out. So we need to avoid that. We need to have these triggers to say, the signal is bad quality, you've put the headset on wrong, the sensors are not touching your scalp, please fix it if you want to make use of this extra functionality. So to build these models, we've had to use a lot of synthetic data, because it's with synthetic data that we can manipulate, we can add different artifacts, we can add it at different levels. And when we're building quality metrics, we need to be able to show this is very good metric because it correlates with this data. So their synthetic data plays a crucial role. So for these quality indices that we've built, we've used a lot of synthetic data. But this is building up to the point where we can now have a standalone headset with sensors that the person can put on at home. And we're confident that now all these checks will take place. And from there, the models can kick in. Once we're at that stage, then we use not a lot of synthetic data. It's mostly real live data. But up until the point where we're ready to do these experiments at home, a lot of synthetic data was used to build many of the metrics in context as well.
I have a million of questions. I'm super interested in this conversation. The kind of analysis that you're doing is usually based on a specific kind of focus, right? So, for example, you are doing posture analysis to understand the emotional state of the user. You're doing eye tracking analysis to understand the focus of the user in a specific kind of situation. Or you're doing like analyzing the galvanic response of the skin to see the emotional state of the user in a specific kind of situation. But in my head, when you combine all those data together, you can create very accurate model that can be potentially be used to create credible chatbots and avatars in the metaverse that will react emotionally in a very believable way. Is this correct?
Yeah, that is what we envision. And this is what we're terming the Internet of Senses. So call it the metaverse on steroids, as I was joking around before, where you can provide all of this information, where your avatars are aware of what you're feeling and they can react accordingly. There are already this whole area of measuring people's mental states and affective states is an area that's been around for quite some time. It's called affective computing. And there are a number of applications right now that are already using these, like, for example, in call centers. If the system detects that the person is very stressed and started yelling, they will immediately get rid of the chatbot and bring in a human person in to the chat. So there are some already places that are making use of these types of technologies to adapt how they interact with the user. So for sure in the metaverse, we envision this something that will play a key role.
If you think about like concierge service or customer service for brand experiences or shops and retail in the metaverse, this is going to be absolutely key, because you're going to need somebody that is going to welcome people into some properties and into some shops. You cannot always have humans on the other side of the of the screen. And
Yeah.
and what I was discussing with some of my colleagues at Accenture the other day is that nobody wants to be in an empty room, right? So if you go to a bar or a club or a restaurant and then nobody's sitting there, you open the door, you look around, you close the door, you
leave.
go somewhere else, right? So obviously you need to populate the world in some way, especially at the beginning when the adoption is massive and the metaverse is booming, but you're not going to have the same kind of mass market adoption that you have on other kind of media. This kind of role of synthetic humans and avatars is going to be absolutely crucial for the future of some of the experiences that are built on metaverse.
Yeah. One application that we're trying to put together with some colleagues at the School of Business is, you've seen with the pandemic, all the shops are closed, everybody's buying their stuff online. And that has taken all of that experience away, right? Like the whole change room experience where you're there with your friends and you walk out and you show your partner. And it's not the clothes that you're wearing. At least for me, what I wear is not necessarily what I like all the time. I also feel like when my partner looks and she's like, oh, that looks really nice, then it's something where it's like, okay, it's going to make her happy. So I'm going to have this clothes. And when we go out on dates, I can use this. And you can see a lot of individuals, they go with their friends and they're trying clothes together. So it's not necessarily what you feel the clothes looks on you, but how you feel your peers are going to think about it. So imagine like this whole kind of new shopping experience where all your friends can put on a headset and you go in a virtual training room or a test room, and then you put on these virtual clothes, you make your own avatar, you try this shirt on, you turn around, and then you see people's reactions, you see their excitement, you see if they liked it, if they didn't like it. So that can automatically drive your you can improve sales drastically. And this is one of the things that these colleagues at the School of Business are mentioning, is that this is a problem that we're not really aware of, but the amount of clothes that gets dumped and burned and shredded every year, the impact that it has in the environment. We're talking about millions and billions of tons of clothes that don't get sold in a year. They just get tossed and burnt and into landfills. It's something that's just beyond the economics, but even environmental impact. So being able to minimize this loss and having clothes that aren't shipped back. You look at Amazon, the amount of stuff that's shipped back because people liked it on the model in the 2D version of the model that was on the screen, but then when you got it home and you put it on, it doesn't look as good on you, so you send it back. Now Amazon doesn't sell that back again. That gets sent somewhere else or it gets sent to the landfill. So the amount of stuff, shipping that gets sent back and forth, clothes that get thrown away because people didn't or tried it on and didn't like it and send it back. Potentially something like this could even have beyond just impact in the metaverse, but it could have potentially impacts in the environment and economy and so on.
Sustainability and so on.
Sustainability, exactly.
Something interesting here. Nick, I know you're normally doing Nick's provocative corner.
Go for it.
But I wanted to throw something out there. So, I mean, obviously, Tiago, we're talking about two aspects here. One, which is obviously you guys are doing the research that's going to enable us to understand, how do we capture this data? How does this data actually work? How do we do the signal processing required to work with this data? But also what we're talking about just now is actually in practice, like once we have these metrics and this processing in place, that this is what we're able to achieve. So obviously, okay, let's say I do go to the changing room in the metaverse and I'm with my friends. Now let's say that I'm with a particularly sensitive friend and, they don't look that great with what they're wearing, but I want to tell them that they're looking, really, really great. There's an element to this technology, right, which can almost read our minds in some sort of way, or read our true sense of expression or emotion, depending on what we want to do. So, there's an element to deception that it can avoid as well. So I just wondered, like, how you perceive that, or you see that, in terms of some of the concerns that some users might have going forward with this kind of technology as well.
Yeah, it's something that I mentioned briefly at our chat yesterday, but the saying that with every ship comes the shipwreck. So with every invention comes the potential pitfalls. And this is one of the areas that to me is the most critical moving forward, is when you have all of this type of information, the privacy and the deception, and how do you handle this type of information? I think the easiest response is to say, in applications, people either choose to enable or disable and they're told the advantages of having it enabled and the disadvantages of having it enabled, and it becomes a user's decision to turn it on or off. Much like we do with everything now these days, right? You sign up to Google, you sign up to any other application, there's pages and pages of things you have to read and the stuff that you're giving away and that you're disclosing with that. So I see it very much like that as well, where it has to be open to the individual about the potential of what could happen, and it's up to the individual to make it happen. But even beyond that, when we talk about privacy and cybersecurity, I think that's even more potentially worrisome, because especially with the advances of machine learning and deep learning and some of the vulnerabilities that these technologies bring, such as adversarial attacks, where you can manipulate the input to make the classifier make a very bad decision. So now you can have situations where you're in the change room and everybody loves it, but then you say somehow there's some sort of cyber attack and it's saying that everybody hates it. And now the person becomes bullied or something like that. So I think beyond the individual privacy, there's this more big picture view of how do you make these connections safe to attacks. And this is true of any application that's looking at deep learning. So you look at deep fakes, for example, these fake videos and fake audios. Like it's a very hot research topic right now, and people that are looking at machine learning and AI is how to actually overcome some of these limitations of these algorithms. But that is definitely one of the biggest thinking corners, as you mentioned, when you talk about this effective computing and monitoring signals and so on, is really on the, well, what if this data gets on the hands of somebody that has bad intentions? What can be done with it and so on? And I suspect you can put the different levels of encryption and different levels of protection and so on. But with every new technologies comes risks and comes these different types of disclaimers that individuals would have to approve or not.
I have another provocative question for you. Do you think that governments should start regulating this kind of technology immediately, not like as they didn't do with social media? And we all know what happened with, misinformation and hate speech and manipulation of masses and so on. Is the metaverse a place for free speech where everybody can say whatever they want, or the government should put some strong regulations around this use of data, or the content that can be shared and so on?
I try to avoid answering questions about governments and political stuff because it never really.
It's okay.
It's one of those areas that is like you kind of like you. No matter what you say, I guess there's two sides of an argument here in terms of that, and I guess that's the big challenge.
I don't know if you followed, but here in Ottawa, the last 3 weeks, there's been this whole kind of free speech convoy and people in front of Parliament Hill protesting against the vaccine mandates and so on and so forth. So it's like government imposed it for the safety of its population. There's always going to be people that are going to be against it. So I know Spain, I believe, has been the first country to actually regulate, they call it narrow rights. So they've come out with a bill to actually state what can and can't be used with these signals and so on. My issue is that these are politicians, right? These are people that don't necessarily have the scientific background. So if you start imposing and putting rules on what can and can't be used for the data, could that potentially in the future slow down research in neuroscience? Of course, it's a tricky world to be in right now because there's a lot of companies that are venturing into this space. So if you look at Facebook and you look at Elon Musk's Neuralink and so on, so there are a lot of companies venturing into this space where there have been scientists that have been doing a lot of this work for decades with strict ethical protocols, following ethical protocols, having protocols approved by a number of other scientists who have expertise in bias, in animal care, and so on. And once you go into companies, it's beyond our knowledge what goes behind those doors, right? So it's not really known how all these experiments take place within those closed doors. Whereas in a university, you have to follow strict protocols. When you're publishing papers, now journals are asking, was ethics approved? What is your ethics protocol number? Did people consent to be part of this experiment? If you don't have that saying in your paper, it doesn't get published. But then if you're in a corporation, you're not caring about scientific papers, you're just caring about products. So those statements aren't really a big factor. So then if government puts out a blanket rule that everybody has to follow, it could slow down research, it could impede research, it could potentially be useful to avoid some of these companies doing very bad things. But then at the same time, how do you balance?
So it needs the input from the people, the researchers, and from the people who have been working with this technology quite extensively to actually understand what kind of regulation would be required, I guess.
Yes. 2 years ago, I would have said that's what would have been needed. But then with this pandemic, you've seen there's all these scientists in COVID task forces that are providing inputs to the government. But ultimately, the decision has to be beyond just the science, right? So with COVID, for example, things were opening up not because COVID was gone, but because the economy had a bigger weight than the science and the impact. So for politicians, they're always weighing these different things that us as scientists, we don't necessarily think about, right? So the impact on the economy and jobs and things like that, like for us as scientists, is not as important as for politicians. So it's a very tricky place to be in. So for sure, there should be scientists advising whatever rules and bills come out. But at the end of the day, what weight they will give to what the scientists are saying, I'm not sure. So it's a very, very tricky, very provocative question, Nick. Indeed.
So if we just move gear a little bit, I guess, out of regulation and out of the data on this side of things, there's a few things that I guess when we were having a chat about this earlier that were brought up. Two things, but I'll focus first on the first one, which is a lot of this data that you're capturing, right? And this is the big moving gear for you guys, is you're capturing real-time measurements, right? So I guess a lot of data in the past has just been captured and then is processed post. But this is actually talking about taking data in real time of the users. So I guess what impact does that actually have compared to these previous methods?
Impact in what sense? Impact on
this impact on what you can do with the data and impact on how you may choose to use it as well.
Yeah. Well, the direct impact is that you can change environments in real time. If you're talking about, for example, we've done experiments in the past with video game developers where we're trying to measure what we call the fun factor of the gamer. So how much fun is the person having in a specific game? And that's typically like the sweet spot that video game developers want, right? You don't want it to be too hard that people are discouraged. You don't want to make it to be too easy so that people are bored. You want to make it challenging enough. And for one person, that challenging enough is very different from the next gamer. So the real-time evaluation of, for example, how much fun you're having or how engaged you are with the game, it allows you to update the game in real time so that no one person is playing the same game ever. It's all based on your reactions. So suppose you're playing a horror movie and there's too many zombies coming at you, you're too stressed and you're not getting anywhere. Then in real time, you could update that in order to minimize the number of individuals coming at you so that you can now calm down a little bit and continue the game. Because I think that's the key sweet spot for video game developers. They want you to play for as long as you can so that for that duration of time that you're in there, you have greater chances to be buying certain things or to be gaining certain things so that the company can monetize. As soon as you leave the game, you're likely not going to come back because that's what you're going to remember. It was too hard. I don't want to play it anymore. At least that's what I see from my kids at home. Like they've reached a certain level at a game that they can't beat. They don't want to play it anymore because to them, they're just wasting an hour and they're not getting anywhere. So that's the valley of death of a video game is once you get to that point where you can't proceed, all of a sudden it's stalled. You move on to the next game.
And there are some quotes both from Software and Capcom that recently announced, both of them, that one dialed down the horror for Resident Evil between Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8 because Resident Evil 7 was too scary. And they wanted to have less jump scare and more exploration and make the game more enjoyable, especially because, especially Resident Evil 7 had the VR version that was really visceral and very, very scary. And second one was for the Elden Ring, that was less difficult than all the other From Software roguelite games, because the level of frustration was so high in the previous games that made the game not so enjoyable for everybody. So you have to find that kind of sweet spot in order to make the game sticky and enjoyable for the gamers.
Yeah, and that's just looking at entertainment. If you look at the clinical world, like having real-time measures of what's happening, if you're talking about neurofeedback, for example, and looking at meditation and using virtual reality to reduce anxiety and reduce stress, it's something that is booming now post-pandemic, where at least here in Canada, stress levels are up significantly with kids, teenagers, seniors. So having a tool that allows you to meditate in virtual reality, and meditation is not easy. It's something that you need usually a lot of feedback on to realize that your mind is off, wandered somewhere else, and you're not focusing on your breathing anymore. So having that type of real-time feedback is very useful to guide you into your meditation session. So if you're able to track the breathing and you're able to track the mental states, if you're wandering or if you're really meditating, and measuring your heart rate and changes in your heart rate and so on. So if these are things that can be done in real time, then you can automatically build better neurofeedback tools that could have greater potential for the reduction of stress and anxiety states that we're all living in today.
I have a question about the future of what you're doing. Where is the field you are on right now going in 5 or 10 years from now?
We've started tinkering, as you can see from this booth that we have behind me, into this multisensory kind of aspect, where audio-visual, so coming from a speech background and an audio-visual background, it's a field where there's a lot of work that's been done over the years. We know very well how much delay we can accept. If my lips are moving and the speech is delayed, what those limits are to make conversations break down, what are the limits in which people can accept. If you're watching a movie and you see the lips moving and the audio is a bit lagged, we know what those values are. There's been numbers and numbers of papers showing these experiments. But once you bring in now smells and haptics, and this is what I think we're going to need to make this metaverse really believable. We can't just be audio visual. Like these past 2 years, I'm part of the Quality of Multimedia Experience Network. It's an European and North American network that's looking at the experience of multimedia systems. We have an annual conference, and over the last 3 years, we've tried every single imaginable system that you can think about to make our annual conference more in-person like. So virtual reality and virtual posters and conversations in virtual reality, conversations with surround sound, so that you can think about actually being, because that was one of the criticisms that you get, right? You're at a conference, and during the coffee break, you hear all these people talking behind you, and you really want to feel like you're at a conference. So we tried systems where you have all this, everybody's in the room virtually, and you can hear all these conversations behind you because you have this. It got nowhere. It really wasn't that impressive. People weren't impressed. People weren't really biting it. So having a metaverse that's only audio and visual, I don't think we'll actually buy it. It's going to be something that people will maybe experience it for a little bit, enjoy it for a little bit, and then it's going to go away. So this is where I think the multisensory aspect needs to kick in. You need to go to a conference. You need to feel like you're there. You need to feel like you're touching people. You want to have FaceTime conversations with your grandma. You want to feel the smell of her cooking in the background. You want to feel the hug, and so on. So I think if we really are talking about metaverse, we really need to bring in all of these different senses, and that will open up. I think for me, for the next 10 years of research, where we have enough to do, because now all of this work that has been done with audiovisual, we need to do again with these senses, right? So if you're watching a movie, there's an explosion and the heater comes on, so you feel the heat, the smoke of gunpowder, or the smell of gunpowder comes on because of the explosion. That really makes you immersed. But suppose you have an explosion and then the scene changes and there's a delay and now this powder smell comes out and it's no longer associated with the scene. That's going to make your experience a little off. So how much of this delay is acceptable? Delays forward, delays backwards, delay with smells, with heat, with wind. So all of these things we don't know the answers to.
We covered part of this conversation during one of our first podcasts that we recorded on the season 1 with Vicky Dobbs-Beck from Industrial Light and Magic X Lab, where we're talking about the experience that they built at the Void, the Star Wars experience, where you had the eaters to simulate the lava heat, and then they have vibrating platform to simulate elevators and all this kind of stuff. So you see that the future of the metaverse is heading towards that direction, even at home.
Yeah. So we ran we finished last week an experiment with this pod behind me, and we were interested in looking at this neurofeedback that I had mentioned. And one thing that's done a lot in Asian countries is called forest bathing, where you immerse yourself in nature and you go on hikes and you stimulate all your senses. You sit there and you meditate, because now you have fresh air, you have the sounds of the birds, the leaves are moving, you have the heat of the sun, or if it's a cool day, you have that cool breeze hitting you. And there's a number of research showing that drops your blood pressure, it drops your heart rate, it reduces your anxiety state, your anxiety levels, your stress levels. So we did an experiment where we try to simulate and actually have a virtual hike where you can now, when you have the leaves moving, you feel the wind. So the fans come on, the sun rises, the heaters come on. So you feel like the heat is, so you actually feel like the sun is coming up. And as you're walking in the forest, we have scents. So we have different trees and scents of soil and so on that get dispersed. And we did the experiment where we started with audiovisual. We then added the smells. We then added the heat. We then added the wind. And we asked people to rate how relaxed they were at the end of the session. And for every single person, the more senses were stimulated, the more relaxed they reported themselves. It was a very high linear correlation, significant differences. So it shows you that just from audiovisual to going from something that's multisensory, there's a drastic improvement. And this was just one example. This was looking at relaxation. This is something we're working on, should be hopefully published soon.
And so one of the things I think you highlighted as well was the more sensors that you start to add, the harder it becomes to read the data, or the more differential the data is?
Well, it's more variability in the data. So this is why we've started with not throwing everything at once, because then at the end, you don't really know what brought this bang. Was it the heat? Was it the wind? Was it the smell? Was it the vibrations? Was it the 360-degree audio? What was it that brought this boost in experience? So you start with adding one at a time, and then you do different combinations, and then you see which one gave you the biggest bang for buck. And that's how we proceed with the research, is doing it step by step so that we see the contributions of each one.
Yeah, and so I'm aware that, like, obviously due to COVID, there's been a setback or delay in being able to bring in people and do these kind of things in quite some time. But I'm interested to know, because obviously you guys are monitoring these different sensors and these different inputs, including, I guess, the level of realism in a visual experience as well. Yeah. So I'm interested to know, obviously, with the limited data you have, maybe just more on the direction of where you can see things sort of ahead. But one of the things that when I speak to a lot of specialists in the sector and in the space, they often argue that a VR experience, for example, does not need to be hyper realistic to create a sense of immersion with the user. And I'm just wondering if that actually correlates with the senses and the data that you guys are picking up.
Yeah. That's actually very interesting, because the pilot that we ran that finished last week, we saw exactly this. So where we started with just the audio-visual experience, and then we started adding more senses. And at the end of the experience, we had individuals report their sense of realism of the application, their sense of presence, sense of immersion. We asked them about if they felt sick, if there was any type of nausea, and their engagement in the experience. And overall experience as well. What was their overall rating of what they found the experience to be like? And what we found was that when you were in only the audio-visual mode, sense of realism had the highest weight. So individuals weighted realism as being very important when only audio-visual was there. And immersion and presence and all those things had very little weight. As you started adding more and more sensory inputs, realism started going down, the importance, and sense of presence and sense of immersion started coming up. So at the end, when you had all these senses stimulated, you went from a weight of 1 of realism in the audio-visual scenario to, I think, 0.53 or 0.43 in the multisensory aspect, where the trees don't really need to look realistic. I'm smelling them, I'm seeing them ruffle, I'm feeling the sun come up. Doesn't need to be hyper realistic, as you said, but my sense of immersion went up. So that was very interesting to see as well. It's still work right now. We've done this particular aspect of looking at the different contributions of different influential factors on overall experience. We've only done data, I think, right now with 8 people. So we're hoping to collect from a few more before we can publish that. But it's exactly in this direction where realism, the more senses you stimulated, had a lower weight, and immersion and presence went up. And to your point about, sorry, I just wanted to touch about on the point of collecting fewer data points during COVID. We spent the bulk of 2020 building tools that could be standalone so that we could drop these devices off at people's homes and have these experiments done at home with minimal supervision from the experimenter. So everything got sanitized, got quarantined for 48 hours, and then we drop off a box at a participant's home. They would sign consent digitally. They would watch a little video showing how to play a specific game, how to put the device on. And then, as I said, all of that stuff that we built that goes in the back end, the measuring of the sensor quality, the measurement of everything, the application of the AI tools, everything gets checked. Once everything was given a go, then the person could go and actually do the experiment. So we actually managed to collect data from a fair number of people over the pandemic by just dropping these tools off at people's homes. And they used it for a week, as many times as they wanted. Every time they put it on, system would click in, data would get streamed to the laptop. The experimenter would get a notification saying, hey, new data is up for evaluation and analysis. So right now we're evaluating this data, but it was something that allowed us to continue collecting data without actually being physically present right next to the person, to the user. But that, of course, brings in a gamut of other things, right? Like some people are playing standing up, others playing sitting down, others are playing for a few minutes and then they take it off and then they come back on. So it adds for the fun part of the research, this variability.
Tiago, amazing. This has been super interesting. Thank you so much for your time. You're wrapping up our episodes. And as usual, if you like this episode of Field of View, don't forget to subscribe or thumb up to like this video. And there are other episodes that are available right now on YouTube, Spotify, and all the other platforms. Thank you so much for being with us. And I'll see you on the next episode of Field of View. Thank you.
Yep.
Through accessible insights, a solid network of support, and recognizing truly outstanding achievements near or far. Big or small, we're in this together. AIXR.